Hello, and welcome to another episode of I Just Want to Be Included. My name is Veronica Olson, and today my friend Sarah is back, and we are going to talk about the long haul of mental health. As parents, we both have kids that have dealt with many mental health struggles, and we have had to find professional resources to help them. This is a daunting task, and one that requires a lot of patience, but also a lot of advocating. It's also another difficult topic. We are talking about our kids who have been depressed and suicidal and self-harm. Not easy things. But as always, I ask that you listen with an open heart and mind. The goal of this podcast is to bring humanity to difficult topics. Every day, we are surrounded by people who are struggling in one way or another. We need to start showing compassion, even when we don't understand what they're going through. As always, anything said in this podcast is based on personal opinion, experience, and thoughts. Nothing said should be taken as professional advice. Every person is different. Every situation is different. Please always look in your community for professional help to deal with whatever you or your family might be facing. Enjoy the episode. All right, today Sarah is back with me, my partner in crime. I love it. And today we're going to talk about the long haul of mental health, and really from a parenting perspective. Both Sarah and I have kids, multiple kids that have dealt with these issues, and we've been dealing with them for several years through different phases of life for our kids, through different ages. One kid doing well, one kid not doing well, two kids not doing well, one kid doing okay, and it's just, looking back, there's so much we have learned. And so I feel like the importance of this conversation is just so many people are dealing with this issue in one way or another, where it's them personally in their house with their kids, or maybe a friend, or maybe your grandkids. And to understand that when mental health issues surface, there is no quick fix, and you have to be prepared to know that it's going to be a long haul, that there's going to be ups and downs, and that you will probably have to shift and change. You'll start on one path, and then you'll find out that you need to go a different direction. And so for me, at least, it's just trying to help other parents learn from my many mistakes, I guess, if you want to put it that way, of just, how to approach this. And it's not easy, and every kid is different. Mm-hmm. Every kid is different. What they need is different. So it's a constant shifting and changing and reaching out to different resources. Has your experience been the same, Sarah?
Yes, very much so. And I think that there's really not a one size fits all for anybody.
No.
And I think it's important to note, coming into this conversation, I understand that my experience is coming from a place of privilege.
Right.
That we have had resources available. Whether it is cash or it's insurance, or there's a wealth of information and resources there and available to us because of kind of our social situation.
Right.
And that's not the same for everybody, and I'm very conscious of that.
Yes.
Not that having that access has made anything that much easier, but there are more resources that we have been able to utilize. And we've had access to things that we've had to pay a considerable amount of money for.
Yes.
But it helped to come with diagnoses and other things to further help, I think, the situation. Not that it's made it any easier.
Right. But it does give you access. When you have insurance, you at least get access to doctors and facilities that you might not otherwise get access to. So even though you end up paying out of pocket for a lot of us, just having access.
Yes.
Or having the choice to go somewhere or not. I don't know how people that don't have those resources do this, because it's like you said, it's hard when you do have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
It is hard to figure out. So I do feel for people who do not have, resources that enable them to just make easy choices and decisions. So just kind of as an overall umbrella, some of the issues that I've dealt with in my home are depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, self-harm behavior, panic attacks, gender identity issues. I don't know. That kind of is just, so when we're talking here, we're talking about a wide range of stuff.
Yes.
And Sarah, I think, have some of that in your plate and more, right?
Correct. I cover a lot of those in my own household. I also have dealt with an eating disorder as a result of anxiety and depression, which is a fun one that most people don't really think about in terms of those types of things going hand in hand, but they definitely do. I have a child who has ADHD and a lot of other health issues that, coupled with anxiety and depression, make those types of diagnoses kind of challenging sometimes. And so, much like you, I've got a wide variety. We kind of hit in some very similar areas, but then there's kind of with some overlap, but then there's other areas where our experiences are a little different.
Yeah. And so it's a wide range. And so as we're talking about kind of our experience and different routes, just understand that we have a lot of experience with different things, but we've also learned every kid is different. Every situation is different. What they need is different. And so this is really trial and error for everybody. I feel like any parent that's taking this on, it's going to be trial and error. You pick a starting point and go with it and see how it goes, and then you pivot when you need to. It's kind of, been the last 10 years of my life.
And I think it's a lot of pivoting and being okay with that and acknowledging when things are working and when things aren't.
Yeah.
When maybe providers are working, when providers aren't working.
Yep.
And kind of and I think that makes it hard sometimes when there's like established relationship, because you're a little nervous as a parent, like, okay, we're going to do something different. But sometimes you have to make those changes in order for your child to benefit, for the benefit of everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I was thinking about was how you tell the difference between what's normal behavior and what's something that needs medical, psychiatric, psychological attention. Because that's not easy. And I remember having a middle schooler who was struggling. And it is hard as a parent, right, to look at that situation and objectively say, this is a problem, or this is just being a normal teenager, right? Because a lot of, especially when you're talking about depression and anxiety, a lot of that, mirrors typical teenage behavior. And so, I was looking back and trying to think about when I first started seeing problems, my first instinct was, oh, she's being a teenager. Because at the end of the day, that's what you want.
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to acknowledge that there's a problem that needs extra help. That is really hard to do.
Tremendously. And there's almost kind of like some guilt when you look back, because I am the queen of parenting failure that way, when just looking at things. And I think just even with my oldest, I was thinking back in when first kind of anxiety and stuff reared its ugly head, she was young, like first, second grade.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of headaches and stomach aches and like those types of things. And it was just kind of this chronic thing that just kept happening. And so at the time, it's like, well, I don't know. So I went to the doctor and I'm like, this is kind of what I'm dealing with. They're like, well, maybe it's her eyes. So send her to the eye doctor. Eye doctor's like, 20/20 vision, things are fine, don't know what to tell you, but it's definitely not our eyes.
Interesting.
And so then it was going back and they're like, well, sometimes kids are just like this. Maybe it's nerves. Never said anything about anxiety. Never anything like that. And finally someone said, you know what? Maybe you should try therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time, to be honest, money was tight. And we had insurance, but our insurance was not the greatest.
Yeah.
And so it was one where we were stuck with the provider. Most of the providers they gave us did not even like have anything to do with children.
Okay.
So we finally found someone who was in our general area, not really that close, who was able to see children. So I'm like, yes, okay, we finally have gotten something. And I mean, this was months of just like circling, calling insurance companies, trying to figure out who is even a provider, calling them, waiting for callback, you know, and like just trying to figure out something to kind of help. Let's see what can happen here.
Right.
And so we finally get to somebody, and she explains that this is going to kind of be like play-based. We're going to talk a little bit, you know, and then we'll bring you in as a parent, you know, at the end of so many sessions, and we'll have this conversation. And so we did it, you know, not really knowing what was occurring, but we went like 3, 4, 5 times, and my child's just not really, nothing's changing. Like, nothing's changing at all in terms of the headaches, in terms of any of these other things. And so, like, as a parent, I'm like, maybe it is something else, you know, like, whatever. And we finally went for, like, our sit-down parent-child. Like, she was there and was, like, coloring or something. And I was sitting next to my husband. And, like, we were still paying for us what was a lot of money out of pocket for these visits and things like that. And we're sitting, and the therapist is just kind of, I don't know, just not necessarily really engaged. And she starts looking down, like, at her shirt. And she's, like, kind of, like, as we're talking, and she's asking questions, but she's, like, looking down at her shirt. And the next thing you know, she's got her shirt in her mouth, and she's eating, like, leftover crumbs off of her shirt while we're sitting there, like, having this conversation. And my husband and I are looking at each other like, what in the world?
Yeah.
Like, what in the world? And she's like, I think, you know, sometimes, like, it could be some anxiety. And she's having this conversation with us, but she's still continuing to, like, be concerned with, like, the food crumbs on her bosom. And
oh my gosh.
It was very disturbing and just really disheartening, because as a parent, like, we had felt like we had come to the end of our ropes. You're our only hope, and yet here we are. And I've just got this really funny feeling about all of this.
If you're only hope, then we're in trouble.
You know, and that was our last session there.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of one of those situations. And, you know, and when you're talking to a young child who has no experience with anything, you know, it's kind of like, kids provide very limited information, right?
Yes, they do.
So it's just kind of one of those situations where, like, what do you do?
And they don't always know how to vocalize what they're thinking and feeling, right?
You're right. And so when you talk about things, like, we then, like, continued on and things like that, and where with this particular child, where things reared its ugly head was during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Really during the pandemic. Yeah. And there was a bunch of life circumstances and things that had happened. And to be honest, they were sleeping a ton.
Yeah.
A ton. But that's what you hear, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's a teenager thing. They're going to sleep a lot, like weird hours, whatever. Yep. But we're sleeping so much. And things started changing, like, a little bit. Like, in terms of temperature and regulation and things like that. My brain, my medical brain, goes, they've got a thyroid issue. That runs in the family, right? Yeah. And so when we go finally to get into a doctor for a regular well check, I just happened to mention, hey, like, here's what I've noticed, you know, like, we're having issues with temperature regulation. We're cold all the time. Like, we're sleeping a lot. Could we maybe run a thyroid panel just, you know, because there is a family history and things like that. And the doctor kind of looked at me like I was crazy.
Right.
And was like, well, like, let's dig into this a little bit more.
Okay.
You know? And once we started digging into this a little bit more, which this had been going on, but, like, your typical things, we're in the middle of a pandemic.
Right.
The social withdrawing, like, you weren't allowed to even walk down the street with, like, friends.
That's everybody.
Like, it was everybody. And so there was a lot of those things where it's like, yeah, you're being a teenager, but we've cut you off from like your whole entire world. There's a lot of life changes happening here.
And the country's a mess.
The country's a mess.
Yeah.
Like, feels like everything, like we're going to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
This kind of seems like normal teenage behavior.
Right.
In terms of your sleeping and things like that. But unfortunately, what was happening is the anxiety and the depression and all of these things had reared its ugly head in such a way that our body didn't know what to do, and it was sleeping and was starting to shut down.
Right.
Which is where the eating disorder comes in.
Right.
And when you look at it, it makes complete sense. But at the time, you know, you were still eating. Was it at an odd time? Yeah. Like, and it seemed like you were covering things, but the reality of the situation is no. Like, it wasn't necessarily normal. And, you know, and I think with a lot of situations and looking at my other children, a lot of times it comes across as like, this is just what is normal. This is how kids are. Like, this is like how they behave. And when you talk to people, like, and I think sometimes too, like peers are like, oh, that's normal. Like my child, or when you look to older people, because I hadn't had kids at that age.
Right.
And they're like, oh yeah, that's like a typical like teenage thing. I remember when, you know,
they'll grow out
situation.
of it.
Yeah, they're going to grow out of it. And so I think sometimes, a lot of times it looks like typical behavior, typical type things. And it's really easy to sometimes miss warning signs before they kind of have exacerbated into like a bigger problem that you're trying to then manage.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking back, definitely there were things I should have been on top of before. And I think part of it is when you put your kids in school with all these other kids, you want your kid just to be like everybody else, right?
Yep.
Just be normal. Just be like everybody else. You know, don't be different. Because as a parent, like it's hard to deal with when your kid's different, right? And it's just hard, and it's challenges that you don't know how to deal with. So I definitely remember having those thoughts. And one thing I remember dealing with child number one is when I first learned that, you know, we really needed to do counseling for these suicidal thoughts and the depression and anxiety. Making a phone call to insurance's behavioral health line, getting the answer machine and saying, we will call you back within 48 hours. I was like, you're kidding me, right?
Yeah.
I've got a suicidal child and you're going to get back with me within 48 hours. Yeah. Awesome.
Thanks for that help.
And then when you do get a hold of somebody, you're dealing with wait lists.
Yep.
All over the place because no one has enough counselors or therapists to see everybody that needs help.
And that's not a new issue. That's been going on for a long time.
Yes.
But we hear about it now more because of kind of, I think, the way that people are talking about these things more, I think. And it's become a little more acceptable to talk about these things. Yeah. But, like, keep in mind, this was a while ago.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
This is a while
ago. Yeah, for this kid, we're probably looking at 8 or 9 years ago. Easily. And so I remember going down that path and thinking, okay, well, this doesn't seem to be working. So I start making other phone calls, and we ended up going a private pay route because the private pay person could get her in within a week.
Yeah.
And so as a parent, private pay was not my first choice, but at the same time, I'm left in a position where my kid's suicidal. Do I wait for a waiting list to magically clear up?
And pray that nothing happens between now and then?
Or do I get them in somewhere next week and hope that works? And so those kind of decisions I've had to make over and over again. And I'm sure you have too. You're trying to find help and you just need a starting place. People will hand you names and phone numbers and practices, and insurance is a big play in that too, what they're willing to cover and who they'll cover. And to wade through all of that when you've got a kid that's struggling is really hard. It is just hard. And you have to be persistent. And you just have to keep picking up the phone and calling. And you have to make some tough decisions. And, you know, one thing I've dealt with too is, you know, dealing with like a pediatrician and a family doctor versus mental health. This is another thing I learned the hard way. Right? Because a lot of times you'll hear depression and anxiety. Well, you know, your family doctor can write a script for that. They can, but that is not what they're trained in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever you get is probably not going to be beneficial to your child, is the reality. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not because the doctor's not trying to help you, but they've got limited time and they have limited training dealing with mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And especially your kid, whether they're second grade, whether they're, in middle school, high school, there's a whole lot of things that come into play there. And I've learned this the hard way too, that just going to, the family doctor for a prescription is not always the best way to go. It might get you some short-term relief, but it's not going to be a long-term solution.
Yeah, it's interesting because things have changed in that realm, I found too, because currently our pediatrician's office, like I had to beg, and we have a long-standing relationship. When my middle child finally had gotten to a very stable point where we weren't having to go to psych to adjust meds, like sometimes a weekly basis, sometimes a monthly basis, but where they're finally like, we have a big wait list and like you are so stable, you're really good right now, let's see if your pediatrician can handle it for you from now, which is basically writing your script every 6 months, basically, when we go in and say, hey, things are good, because we're at a really stable point. But I had to beg for them to even be willing to take that on anymore, because I think they've come to a point where it's like, you're right, we don't have this specialty. And so I find now, as I'm looking with my youngest, they're a lot quicker to refer out to other people who may be better able to fit, which I think is in the future is going to serve families better than the way that it used to be.
Yes.
Where it was kind of this one size fits all. We're going to start you at a low dose and then this is just going to solve everything.
Right.
Which is maybe a Band-Aid temporarily.
Yeah.
But isn't, addressing bigger long-term issues there.
Yeah. And I recently had the experience with my youngest child of the difference of sitting in with a family doctor prescribing stuff for anxiety and depression, and then going to see a PA who specializes in psych. Oh my gosh. 10 minutes versus an hour.
Yeah.
I was shocked at how detailed and thorough that appointment was with the PA who specialized in psych meds.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked. And I was like, I wish I had known about this 4 years ago, at least.
Yeah.
But the path to getting access to the right people is hard.
It's grueling, and you really have to be persistent sometimes, and really conscious of the fact of what's working, what's not working, and really advocating, because it's kind of a funny thing as kids get older, they're just expected to advocate for themselves, and they're supposed to do all of these things, but when they're having mental health crises or are just not at a good place, they can't advocate for basic needs, let alone for appropriate care or they can't even think outside of the here and now, let alone what things could be like, right? Yeah. So sometimes as a parent, you really have to advocate and you really kind of have to push, and it's this isn't necessarily working, and being okay with the fact of saying this isn't working, we need to try something else.
Right.
What else do you have for me?
Right. Absolutely. And I remember as a teen dealing with depression and starting therapy, and I really didn't understand the concept that this is a process. This is not we hand you a prescription and you're going to start feeling better in a week. That's not how this goes, And so with kids, especially, and with parents, you need to understand that when you do start on meds, when you do start with a therapist or a counselor or whoever you're seeing, it is a process, and things are not going to get better overnight. They might actually appear to get worse before they get better, is what I have experienced. And so to kind of talk your kids into, you just need to hang in there.
Yeah.
Because kids will very quickly say, well, this isn't working for me.
Yep. Or when it gets hard, we decide that we're going to quit because it gets very uncomfortable.
Yeah, therapy is hard. Mm-hmm. It is hard work. Because whether you're dealing with, emotional baggage you're keeping in, or whether you're trying to retrain, your thought process or your behaviors, whatever that is, none of those are easy changes. So parents and kids need to be prepared. it's going to be a process. And you have to understand that the participation level is going to come up and down. It's probably a nice way of saying that, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes if they're just willing to show up, even if it's with a scowl on their face and they look like this is the last place they wanted to be, the fact that they're in the car and they're willing to show up sometimes is a lot.
Yeah.
Even if it's kind of this, like, you as a parent want to hide underneath, like, the seat because their body language and everything else is kind of saying, I really don't want to be here. I hate you. I hate this type situation.
Yeah.
The fact that they just showed up sometimes is huge.
Yeah.
And that's all you can ask.
Absolutely. And then, you know, one thing I wanted to bring up too was this idea of like parent responsibilities versus what the responsibility is on the kid. And this gets hard and messy because one of the things that took me aback, and I remember, you know, back when we were first dealing with this with the first kid, you know, you go into the psychiatrist's office and the first thing they start asking you, well, is there a family history of this? I'm like, whoa, what am I? What are you grilling me for?
Yeah. Does this look like this is my issue? No, I brought you here. My child's here.
Like, dang it. I didn't want to talk about me. But retrospectively, I wish I had been more open and honest about my experiences earlier. I was under this false assumption that, you know, if I don't talk about it and it doesn't exist, it will not be an issue for my kids, which is not true. Yep. It really is not true, unfortunately. But it is hard when you step in, especially when you have teenagers, to this area of mental health because you might be allowed in the room on certain occasions. For the most of the time, you're not, right? And so hopefully whatever therapist you're working with is very upfront with you about when they contact parents and when they don't. They have very firm boundaries on that. They should.
Yep.
Right? But you're giving a lot of trust over, right? And if you have a kid like Sarah and I both have these kids where they get in the car and they say nothing. How's therapy? Fine. Okay. That's what you're getting.
Yep.
And you're not getting any more. And it's not that you want details, but you want some reassurance like, this is worth it, right?
Right.
Like,
your therapist isn't eating off of their shirt, right? Like, we are, like, making progress here somehow.
This, you know, $500 I'm taking out of our budget every month is worth it. This, you know, hour-long me driving somewhere and sitting in an office and driving home once a week, this is all worth it, right? And that satisfaction is not there for a long time, to be honest. You know, it's just you have to start doing things and just see what happens, be patient. It is hard. Yeah. It is seriously hard.
Yeah. And I think sometimes those wins come in other ways.
Yes.
Where it's like, wow, we had a 2-minute conversation. Like, I find myself high-fiving my husband when we've had, like, a positive interaction of something. Like, that's a win. Like, we are taking this. This is a win. Like, we did something. Yeah. And I think it can get very discouraging at times, and especially when kids are in crisis. Yeah. And, like, sometimes even when it kills you because you already know the answer. Right. Like, still keeping them included. Asking if they want to do things, even though you know it's going to be no. Even if you know, like, you're going to be rejected, and it's like you are sitting here asking them for the world, and you're just wanting to know if they want to do A, B, C, D.
If they'll come out of the room.
Even to come out of the room.
Right.
You know?
That is asking a lot sometimes.
Sometimes it is asking a lot. But just keeping that persistence, which is hard because it's weary and it's tiring. And it's like, why am I putting forth all of this effort when, like, it seems like nothing is working? Yeah. But it does. And I think, like, celebrating those wins when you see them, even if it is a 30-second conversation where there wasn't an eye roll or there wasn't, you know, some sort of, like, disdain for you're talking to me. Why are you talking to me? Right. Sometimes those are huge wins.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I remember having, the other thing I was dealing with, too, was when I kind of step in and out, right? And I think my daughter, she was still in high school, maybe 17 at the time. She had hit kind of a lull, and she was really struggling. And I said, when's the last time you've been to therapy? Because we were at a point where she was taking herself. Well, we had to cancel 1 week because the therapist had to take her daughter to college and move her in. I was like, okay, when was that? A month ago. Have you been back since? No. I don't think it's doing anything for me. And I'm looking at this kid who's like melting into the table, is how I would describe it. Like they were just so physically and emotionally done. And I'm like, okay, well, we can't just do nothing. That's not an option. And so at that point, I picked up the phone and I called the therapist myself. And I said, so I hear she hasn't been in for a while. No, she hasn't called me. Let's get her in. And in addition to that, let's start talking about meds, which had not been an issue for this kid yet. But I was like, we need to do something more. And convincing those kids that I know this is hard, but we're not going to give up.
Yeah.
And it's hard as a parent to sometimes figure out where that line is. But sometimes you have to step in and say, okay, I know you're struggling. I know you're frustrated, but we are not giving up.
Yeah.
We're going to do something else and see if that works. And if that doesn't work, we'll try something else. On and on and on. But, you know, I had to start asking questions. When's the last time you've been to therapy? You know, those kind of questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And in our house, it's been a very, like, hard line in the sand. When it's your health and it's your safety. At this point, like, these are, like, non-negotiable type things. Like, non-negotiable. And, like, we're going to work through this one way or another. We're going to get you the help that you need. Like, and we've had very tough conversations, like, inside the house of, like, is this beyond what we can handle here right now?
Right.
Like, and whether you can admit that or not, as a parent, I'm telling you, we are beyond a point we need further help.
Right.
And sometimes in making those like super hard decisions. And before we had kind of gotten to that, I remember calling my mom and I was just sobbing. And I'm like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't do this. And so she came over, she dropped everything. She came over. She's like, she's coming with me. Yeah. And like, and telling your child, and I told her at the time, and it was the hardest thing. I said, this is for both of us.
Right.
This is for both of us because the alternative is going to be a lot worse right now. And you need someone else speaking into your life right now and just being with you while you are just blah. And I need a break. And I was very honest. Like, I'm just like, because this is not working and it's not helping anybody. And you need help and I need help. But sometimes, like, me getting that help is being able to take care of myself and say, I can't do this alone.
Yeah. And I think that's really hard too, because as a parent, I remember feeling like everything was on me all the time. I've got to figure all this out. I've got to find all the answers. I've got to carry everyone else's load. And to stop and say, this is hard, I need help, is not something I was trained to do.
Oh, no. Are you kidding me?
To do that?
Admit, like, vulnerability and that you don't have it all together and you're not this, like, perfect person. Are you kidding me?
No, it stinks. But, and that does you such a disservice because it wears you down.
Yep.
And your kid gets frustrated and you do hit these places where, like, you cannot move forward.
Yeah.
You just can't. And you need someone else to step in, whether it's a family member or a friend or whatever that looks like. Sometimes you just need outside help. But as parents, we're never told, like, it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
Please
it's okay to admit that you can't handle this alone.
Yes.
Just that you can't handle this alone.
Yeah. Because these get to be really big things. And you can't handle them alone.
No.
And it's really, really gets tough. And when you have kids that are going to school, you know, and trying to get schoolwork done, or trying to work, or trying to be part of a sports team, or all these other things that our kids are trying to do because we're trying to keep them normal, it makes it even more challenging.
Yeah.
You know, and it's really hard as a parent to look at the landscape and say, what's the priority here? Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to Sarah for sitting down and having this difficult conversation with me. Next week, we will continue our conversation about the long road of mental health. Hang in there. We are all doing the best we can. Have a good week.